Tēnā koutou, ngai tahu tangata, ngai tahu iwi, ngai tahu waka, tuai pau nāmu mana whenua, ngai tu ahuriri. E kore rawe e whakamutu ngā mihi ki ao koutou, ai whakarangatiri tō tātou nei hui, e arahi ana i a mātou nei, nō reira tēnā koutou. Just to acknowledge ngai tahu, ngai tu ahuriri for guiding us through our hui, the traditional landowners and kaitiaki of ngā pā kihi, whakatekateka o Waitaha. Thank you. E te whānui, e te whare. Tēnā koutou i raro i te korowai o rangi nui, i runga i te whāriki o te papatua anoku, i roto i te whare, i roto i te māhana o te whare e tūnei, i roto i te māhana o tātou e hui hui nei. Greetings to everyone under the cloak of the Sky Father, on the woven mat of the Earth Mother, in the warmth of this house and in the warmth of us who are gathered here today. I would like to acknowledge our communities, those who have been the main targets historically of white identity, racism, xenophobia, violence and terrorism. Historically, state-led sometimes, led by different groups, and more recently through the expression of lone act of violence. Nō reira, I roto i te ao o te ihirama, our Muslim brothers and sisters, assalamu alaikum. Ma'aba bikum jumian, shukram laika, assalamu alaikum. To our brothers and sisters from the Indian and Chinese communities, who for the best part of a century and more recently during changes to immigration laws have suffered significant racism initially under a white New Zealand policy, are the main victims of abuse on the street and violent assaults. Ki te mea no haina, ni hao ma, tang zhang hao, wan ying wen ho, wan ying jin tien, wen ho wo de pang yo, wan ying lai dao set so fang ze, she ni hao ma. To our brothers and sisters in the Indian community, namaste, namaskar, apashwagahe meri doston, subi kobatai, arivad danyavad, namaste. To our brothers and sisters in the Pacifica community who were subject to the institutionalized racist dawn raids during the 1970s, and an apology is impending. No hamoa, talo whalava, i le lei lava o na ai atu i au tauma, awhia mai matala mai ao i le nei aso, i le nei whale, mana tele le nei aso, e poto maa whaatasi le tātou ainga. No Tonga, Malo i le lei, tali le lei ki he whaleni, ki he ohoni, loto whewhe ke hanga atu, ko i aho whaka whewhe i nei ki a tiki tautolo, malo e le lei. Excuse me. So I had three things prepared. We were recipients of all the reports yesterday, and I've worked my way through a bunch of those. They're very impressive. There's been a lot of work completed over the last 2 years. You can see how the reports and the policies come together. They're integrated, they're comprehensive, and they're detailed. Over time, there's obviously going to be adjustments and amendments. There'll be things that need to be looked at in a different way. One of the things that does stand out, we need to strengthen the tiriti component in those policies. The national strategy mentions Te Tiriti, and then in the early part then doesn't really mention it again. There are Māori words here and there. Sometimes I don't quite understand why they're in this part and not the other part and those sorts of things. But that in part is quite understandable, because the bulk of our treaty policy was put together in the 1990s and the early 2000s during the phase of treaty settlements for tribes. And we're living in a bit of a different world now. Some of you will be aware of the treaty policy approach that talks about Māori being tangata whenua and other migrants being tangata tiriti. Who's kind of familiar with that? Yeah, that's quite popular. That's not too bad. A couple of things that it doesn't do. One, it tends to undervalue the agency of Māori roto i te tiriti. We're tangata whenua. It's kind of fluffy, we're nice, and we'll host you a hui, and you're guaranteed to get a good feed. The tangata tiriti bit, drawn from the preamble of the treaty, did allow for settlers to come to New Zealand, but the reality is, brothers and sisters, is that when the treaty was signed, no one thought it was going to grow to 5.1 million. Hey, it has, and we live with that reality, but maybe we need to look at it a different way. So one way we can look at it is Māori are iwi takitake. We are the indigenous people of Aotearoa, New Zealand. We're also iwi tuatahi. We are the first tribes, first peoples, and First Nations of Aotearoa, New Zealand. We are tangata tiriti tuatahi. We are the first treaty peoples. The first treaty we signed was in 1835 with the Crown, and it made no reference to settlers. No offence, I'm just saying it did. Pākehā are like tangata tiriti tuatahi anō. They were the first partner under the treaty in 1840, and that is the gateway that allowed people to come to New Zealand through various mechanisms. Our new communities, I sometimes refer to as hāpori tāwāhi hau, the new communities that have come from overseas, they are like tangata tiriti maha maha. The key message in there is that we are all tangata tiriti. We're tangata tiriti tuatahi. So what does this mean if we apply it in policy? Well, one of the things it means is there is a specific role in leadership by Māori at the table of diversity. We have suffered and endured and been resilient in the face of racism for the longest time in our country. We know what it means. We understand that there are other communities, the Muslim community, the Indian community, the Asian community also suffer racism. So we have a role now in not only advocating our community, but advocating on behalf of those other communities who suffer racism and violence. Those other communities, they also have a place at the table because they are tangata tiriti. The table of diversity is a table of discussion. For the Crown, that is their main approach at the moment. They will talk to us, make some notes. They will talk to the Muslim community, make some notes, talk to the Indian community, make some notes, and then they will summarise and make decisions. The table of diversity is the table of discussion. The table of equality under Article 3 of Te Tiriti is a table of decision making, and we need to be part of the decision making. The decision makers need to look like us. If someone calls, this happened, someone calls my child the N-word, so a white person calls my child an N-word, and then I go to see a Pākehā person to get it solved and say, what are we going to do? And they say, well, we're going to address this with education and inclusivity. That doesn't quite work, because you begin to look like each other. What we need is someone there who looks like us and says, I understand how you feel. Now, I don't understand what it is like to lose a brother or sister, a son or a daughter in a lone actor shooting. I don't. But through my history, I know what it is for our ancestors to have fought at the Battle of Kororareka, for our hapu to have lost over 200 people at the Battle of Orako, for us to become landless, lose our language, experience racism. Yesterday, on one of the panels, we were told that the media is not racist, it's ignorant, and we would be helpful if we pointed out the ignorance and then they would address it. Last night I was going through my files and I came up with this snapshot of the Northern Advocate 1954, a note from the Northern District Council. We're not going to build the library in the proposed location in Kaitaia because there are a risk of pests, e.g. dogs and Māoris, full stop. And I was thinking to myself, that is very ignorant. Yeah. But I was also thinking to myself that when those things happen, it's not my responsibility to be the conscience for the media organisations, it is theirs. It is definitely theirs. So I'm going to shorten my piece. One thing we have missed, one of the things that's going to be important is the counter-narratives. And one thing we have missed in the discussions is that a lot of the online racism today is actually being driven by white mums and dads and grandparents, particularly on Facebook. Now, there are a lot of reasons for that. Partly it's that historical legacy. A lot of the things I've said are not new. They've been said throughout colonisation by settlers, by missionaries, by politicians, by our governments. Those people were brought up in those generations where there were separate toilets for Maori and Pākehā in New Zealand. There was an accord in 1966 of 160 of 200 local bodies in New Zealand supporting a white New Zealand policy. That's profound. For those people, those attitudes, we don't want to go to unconscious bias, but the thing is that they're raised in a prevailing environment where that is how people thought. For them it becomes self-evident. And when Māori become a bit uppity, when Muslim communities, the Asian community are growing in our communities, that makes them angry because it goes against something they believe is self-evident. A self-evident racism. Now, a couple of things we need to do, mostly I think I'll leave that for the questions, but one thing is we need strong counter-narratives. And one of the key things that's being said today is that our society is becoming increasingly separatist. The presence of new migrant communities and the rise of Māori is undermining the fabric of our society, and it threatens our unity. But in fact, the opposite is true. The fact that we are all here today together is proof of that. If you go to hui, outdoor events, sporting events all over the country, there is greater presence of Māori. In Palmerston North, where I live, we have a multicultural festival. The first time I went was about 10 years ago. There were 5,000 people. There are 25,000 people there every year now. The racist component of our Pākehā society is smaller It's threatening and it's dangerous and it's a concern, but it's smaller than we perceive. During the referenda on Māori wards, a lot was made of the returns that said 70% of voters are against it, 60%, 80%. The thing we missed is that the voter turnout was 30 to 40%. And it was a 20 to 30% who were strongly advocating against them, but the majority was okay with them. And I watched a lot of the debates that were happening in the central North Island over discussion of Māori wards this year. And the support from Māori communities, migrant communities, and a lot more of our Pākehā leadership and communities was strong across the board. Our future lies in our youth. So we have the messages of unity. We are in fact closer together and less separate than we've ever been. But the future for us lies with our youth. You know, I have a daughter, she's 21, she's at university. Her group of friends include a Filipino, Vietnamese girl, Malay girl, and I've got to kind of practice all these little bits of language and stuff when they come around for lunch, you know, my kind of eyes are rolling around. You know, my wife is Samoan. We are coming together. She's very, very nice looking, and I as soon as I met her, I thought, man, I'm going to behave really well for a whole year and make her mine. And, you know, we are closer together, and there are a whole lot of other cultural connections that go with that. My young 10-year-old, she can speak in 4 or 5 languages now, bits and pieces, and her friends include a girl from Africa, 2 from the Middle East. You know, she plays in a football team, and I look at them, and I'm thinking, holy smoke, like, you know, it's multicultural, it's diverse, and it's really interesting. Now, one of the things with her group of friends is they understand that racism exists, and they are comfortable with it. And that's really interesting because they're way more relaxed and way less tense than my generation would be at that age. We would absorb it and stay silent, but they talk quite openly about it, and then they go and play. And that is the future that we need to invest in. Hoi anō e te whare pūtoi, nā haku noa he mihi atu anō ki a tātou, a tēnā tātou katoa. Kia ora.